Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, July 23rd around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Big Ten Media Days. They start in Indianapolis today. I'll break down the biggest talking points as I see it as we go into this week that is just going to be absolutely jam-packed up there in Indianapolis. Then we had some news from the ACC Media Days that started yesterday. It sounds like Florida State and Clemson are staying put, at least for the time being, in that conference through the 2025-26 season, and that does answer one of the questions, but brings up a ton of more questions around that, so we'll break down all of those today. Then we'll get into kind of an interesting trend around first-year quarterbacks, whether that be transfer or freshman quarterbacks that come in, and how successful they can be their first year. And we'll break down how I see the big-time transfer quarterbacks or the big-time quarterbacks going into a new system will fare this upcoming season. Then we'll get into the Big 12 to kind of finish out the show. We'll do hinge players in that conference, have 6 guys that I want to break down for you all. Then we'll finish out the hot takes for the contenders in that conference where there are just so many. So we'll break down all of the guys that you need to know and definitely a hot take around all of them. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that's GSMCpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. Let's talk about the Big Ten Media Days. They kick off today in Indianapolis, and there's a ton to talk about. Unlike the ACC, most of the things are on the field, which is a very nice thing in today's age. But there are so many things to break down for this week, and definitely, to me, it starts with the Ohio State Buckeyes. But let's start to break down this schedule real quick, and Ohio State kicks off today. We will get to hear from Ryan Day today. We'll also get to hear from Luke Fickell over at Wisconsin, which would be very, very interesting to hear from. Greg Schiano really has things rolling at Rutgers. Would be fascinating to hear from him. And then David Braun, someone at Northwestern who took over in very, very interesting circumstances a year ago, did a fantastic job throughout the 2023 season and is going into the season with some questions, no two ways about that, but definitely a lot of energy around that program. You also have Illinois and Purdue going on today, so if you want to check that out today. Then tomorrow you'll have Indiana with their new head coach Kirk Cignetti coming over from JMU after just a remarkable year. Mike Locksley is really heating up the recruiting trail. It will be fascinating to hear from him. Sharon Moore will be the main event for the most part. Definitely a huge amount of questions around him and how he's going to kind of handle this next little bit. Then you have, obviously, PJ Fleck, who's going to be massive to watch. Definitely will be super, super interesting and see how that unfolds. Dan Lanning is going to be another one that everyone's going to want to watch. And then Jed Fish absolutely will be interesting. And then Iowa, Michigan State, Nebraska, Penn State, UCLA, and USC will finish out the week. And you'll have Iowa will definitely be really interesting to hear from. Jonathan Smith taking over at Michigan State. Matt Rule obviously going into a huge year at Nebraska. And then Penn State and USC definitely have a lot to prove and just cannot wait to hear from Deshaun Foster for the very first time as the UCLA head coach. But let's start to jump into the biggest talking points as we head into this week, and it starts with the team that everyone's been talking about this entire offseason, really, and that's the Ohio State Buckeyes. Everyone is talking about this team, and everyone expects this team to be a national title contender. And not only that, but if they don't win one, there will be people saying it is a failure out there. There's no two ways about that. It's not the case, but there will be people that will be saying that. There is a ton going into this week, obviously. Will Howard is not going to be there, which is kind of unfortunate. In fact, there's only 5 quarterbacks across all 18 teams that will actually be in attendance, so kind of an interesting one. Hudson Card's the only one that's played Big Ten football before, so a very, very interesting kind of crop of quarterbacks there this week, but we'll still get to hear from a ton of people. Emeka Egbuka will be there, and he'll give as much good info of how far along Will Howard is as anyone. And maybe if someone else is maybe a little bit further along than Will Howard is right now, I think Will Howard is definitely the guy as of right this second. But who knows what the leash is. So we'll definitely get a little bit of an idea with that. And then how he kind of fits into Chip Kelly's offense will be very interesting to hear from. Also, we'll get to hear from Denzel Burke and Jack Sawyer. This will be awesome to hear from, especially Denzel Burke, in my opinion, because he'll get to give us an idea of how Caleb Downs is fitting in, how that back end is looking, and right now on paper it looks just absolutely ridiculous. So you add someone like Caleb Downs, it'll be really fascinating to hear from him. So it'll be really, really awesome to hear from all these guys. And I think one of the biggest things I want to hear, frankly, is I want these guys to be crazy confident, like a little bit arrogant, honestly, in the way that they answer questions about what they expect from this season, because that's the way they should be approaching this season. They are the team to beat. They are the most talented team in the country, and there's a lot of juice around that program. So I feel like they need to come in with just a little bit of arrogance and definitely be a little bit overly confident in some respects, but definitely be a team that walks in with their head held high, with their chest out, and say, no one's going to beat us this upcoming year. So definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch from that respect. And then you got some new teams joining the party, and particularly Oregon will absolutely be the topic of conversation. We'll get to hear from Dan Lanning, which will be fascinating to hear about the recruiting he's been doing over the last little bit, and some rumors around Phil Knight and NIL, but those are kind of goofy in and of itself. And then you have Dylan Gabriel will be in attendance, which will be awesome to hear how he's filling into Will Stein's offense. Jeffrey Bossa will also be there, and that's the leader of this defense. So we'll get to hear a lot of the different things about the transfers that came in, how they're affecting the defense, how the defense is looking coming up to the season, and if they've taken the steps forward in the places they need to really compete this upcoming season. But then you have some other teams. Obviously, you have USC, and it's definitely going to be really interesting to hear from Lincoln Riley. It's obviously not been the greatest summer months for the USC program, but still a lot of things to like over there. Miller Moss is going to be there, which is a huge thing because there was still part of me that thought Jade Mayava had a shot to be the starter at the beginning of the season. That's totally put to rest now. It will be Miller Moss trotting out there. Jonah Monaheim is one of the best offensive linemen in the country, will be there. But then Kamari Ramsey, the safety, is the guy that I really want to hear from because I want to hear what DeAnton Lynn has, how that defense is kind of being put into place, and how the energy around that defense should be or is a little bit different this upcoming year. So definitely will be fascinating to hear from all of those guys, but it sounds like we know the starter for USC at the very least for the upcoming season. Then we also got UCLA and Washington. Probably won't get too much coverage. Obviously, Jed Fish at Washington will be very interesting to watch. It definitely will be fascinating to hear from him about that transition from Arizona to Washington. And then UCLA with a new head coach. I'm very excited to see Deshaun Foster, but they will definitely not be at the very top of the headlines. I can almost promise you that. But then let's move right along here. And Sherrone Moore has a ton of questions that are going to be really, really interesting to hear him answer. And this would be number one on the list if there weren't so many other things to talk about in this conference. But he's taken over for the reigning national champion and a guy that really is maybe one of the best coaches in that school's history in Jim Harbaugh. I'm sure a lot of Michigan fans would tell you that. And they're bringing three guys from Michigan: Donovan Edwards, Max Bredesen, and Makari Page. So we won't get to hear from Alex Orji or any of the quarterbacks, but Donovan Edwards and Max Bredesen will give us plenty to know about Alex Orji, about Jack Tuttle, about which one they feel a little bit more confident in. And then Makari Page is really interesting to me because Wink Martindale is coming in as the defensive coordinator, and he's kind of a wild card in some senses. I mean, he's a fantastic football mind, and I have very little doubt that they're going to be a really good defense, but they're going to be a little bit different, I would have to imagine, and definitely be a little bit more... You know what, I don't really know what the overall differences will be, but it definitely will be really interesting to hear from Makari Page about what those differences are, how they go about business, and how Wink Martindale is kind of taking the NFL approach and bringing it down to Ann Arbor and see how that really works this upcoming season. And then obviously Nebraska. It's going to be a huge topic of conversation. This is one that absolutely would be a bigger topic of conversation if Ohio State and Oregon and Michigan weren't clogging the top of this conference. But the reality is it'll be fascinating to hear from Matt Rule about where is Dylan Raiola at? Is he, further along than you thought? Is he right on schedule where you thought? Is he, a little bit behind, which is understandable as being a freshman coming in. Ben Scott, the starting center, will be there, which will be really interesting to hear from him because he has a very unique perspective on the quarterbacks and gets to work with a lot of these guys. So he might be able to give us as much information about Dylan Raiola's development as really anyone. So that'll be fascinating to watch. And then you have Isaac Gifford and Ty Robinson coming in from the defensive side of the ball. And frankly, I don't really have a lot of questions about their defense going into this year. They're going to be good. I have very few doubts about that, but it'll be interesting to hear from them about how they feel going into this season, how some of the new transfers are filling in, and all of that different stuff. So it'll be fascinating to hear from all of those guys, but at the end of the day, Matt Rule is going to be the show. He's going to be the guy that everyone's looking at to say, how is Dylan Raiola looking? How are the transfer wide receivers looking? How is Bly Hill on the back end of that defense looking? Tommy, all of these guys that are being put together for a huge season, hearing him kind of talk about this team will at least give us an idea of how confident he is in this team. And then, I apologize for that. And then we obviously have a number of things to talk about, Penn State being a huge one. Definitely will be really interesting to hear from James Franklin about just how everything is going, how those coordinators especially are fitting in. Tom Allen and Andy Kotelnicki coming in are going to be absolutely huge for this team. They actually, frankly, I think are probably the two most important people on the team. So it'll be really, really interesting to hear from those guys. Drew Aller is someone that will not be in attendance, which is rather upsetting, frankly. I'd love to hear from him, but Tyler Warren will be there, the veteran tight end, so he'll give us a good idea of how Drew Aller's doing, how his confidence is kind of building up going into the season. And then Jalen Reed, the really talented safety that they have. It's going to be interesting to see how he speaks about Tom Allen and the way that they're going about business on the defensive side of the ball this upcoming year, because it's going to be a little bit different. Manny Diaz and him, they're similar defenses, but not necessarily the same by any means. So it'll be fascinating to hear the ers and ahs that have been added to that defense. And then on top of that, you have other talking points like Iowa's revamped offense will be interesting to hear about. Kurt Cignetti making his debut at Indiana will be fascinating to hear from him. Wisconsin moving forward, trying to be a little bit more of a contender in this. And then obviously, we're always on the lookout for any house settlement updates or possible revenue split updates, that type of thing. So it'll be really, really interesting to see kind of how all of this fits and all of the different talking points going into this season. But at the end of the day, it is going to be fascinating to hear from all of these different guys and hear how this conference is shaping up going into this season, because it's one of the weirder ones around the country, definitely, and definitely one that is a little bit up in the air. It'll be really fascinating to see what happens. And I think Anthony asks a great question here. I think Ryan Day's scheme is different. There's no two ways about that. Handing it over to Chip Kelly is a little bit different of a scheme as well, and a little bit more run heavy, although it's a little bit more finesse runs type thing, a little bit more jet sweeps, some, option type plays, different things like that. So frankly, I think Ohio State will be a little bit more run heavy this upcoming year, and I think it'll really benefit them because not only who they have at running back, but also the quarterback Will Howard can definitely scoot a little bit. So although, yes, Ryan Day's philosophy, his scheme, the way he goes about business on offense is definitely different and may have hurt him the last couple of years in the Big Ten. I think they'll get a little bit closer to everyone else in the Big Ten this upcoming year while still staying just different enough with the wide receivers they have on the edge. But at the end of the day, it's going to be awesome to hear from all of these guys, and will be really interesting for the next 3 days to unpack all of the things that come out from this. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Florida State and Clemson. They are staying put in the ACC for now. We will break down all of the different questions that come from this and how it's not that great of a thing for the ACC, but we'll break that down right after this.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Big Ten Media Days that are kicking off in Indianapolis today, and we'll be going through the week, and definitely a lot of really interesting things to break down in the Big Ten. But let's get into segment 2. The ACC Media Days started yesterday, and there was already the biggest news that we were waiting for has already come out from that. Definitely huge news. Florida State and Clemson are staying put through the 25-26 season. Definitely a huge thing for the ACC, and has a lot of implications. Definitely something that answers one big question that we had is, is Florida State and Clemson going to be in the conference after this year? That has been answered. There's a million more questions that come because of this, and let's start to break those down. Definitely a lot to unpack here, and I think where I want to start is there are pros here for both, and there are cons here for both sides. And I think for the ACC, the biggest pro is you now have some time. You have time to fix this issue that has been created by two of your bigger entities in your conference. So it'll be really interesting to see how they kind of go about this, but it's time to get aggressive. It's time to kind of get out in front of this and start to bring in teams, start to throw out feelers to teams in the Sun Belt, in the American, in the whatever. It does not really matter all that much, but the reality is they need to start getting aggressive. They need to start putting their foot forward and be a little bit more intentional about the way that they're going about this, because frankly they've been sitting for quite some time trying to fight this in court and do all of the other stuff, and I understand it's a lot to juggle, but at the end of the day you need other teams coming in if these two are walking out, and they are walking out one way or another. They are finding their way out of this conference, and that would put you at 15 teams, and you have to stay above 15 teams, keeping that buffer above 15 teams where you're at 17 right now. If you can stay at that 17, 18 marker, then you're in good shape. If you can't, then ESPN's going to have a little bit of a problem with you, and you're going to have to deal with that. And that's something we'll unpack in a little bit. But teams like, USF, Troy, JMU, App State, whoever it is, you need to start getting some teams because excuse me, you need to start getting some teams because this is coming, and you're losing two big-time entities in your conference, and when they go, others might follow. So you have to keep that buffer alive. You have to keep that, 2-team, 3-team, 4-team buffer between you and 15 teams, because that 15-team mark is a really dangerous one for them to be on, because ESPN could just pull the contract if they go below that. So definitely would be a huge thing here. But another big-time con for this is you got to deal with these two teams a little bit longer, and that's obviously not ideal. It's kind of one of those things that I think Brett Yormark did an incredible job at when he was at the Big 12. He got hired and then fairly quickly got a deal in place to get Texas and OU out of the conference quicker, and that was the better thing for the conference. Not that, Texas and OU leaving was the better thing, but you had to make it happen as quickly as possible, because then you can figure out what life is after them. And I think this is the same case for the ACC. Now, the problem is you can't necessarily do that, because that would just be yielding all of this money over to them and not having them pay the exorbitant amount that you want to get from them. So it's a little bit of a battle here, but at the end of the day, as time goes on, that money drops a little bit and things get a little bit more sketchy, and other teams have more time to kind of figure out what they want to do. So that's kind of the biggest thing here, and maybe the biggest con for the ACC is the fact that there are other teams watching this, and they're watching it very, very closely. UNC, Duke are the teams that I've kind of circled the most, and I think a lot of people have for they are the ACC in a lot of ways. If ESPN or if whoever figures out that UNC and Duke are trying to find their way out, that's going to dry up very quickly, that media contract. I promise you that. So that's going to be the biggest thing here is at some point, Jim Phillips and this conference in general just needs to get more aggressive. They need to realize that their conference is changing very, very rapidly, and if they don't get two hands on the reins and possibly pull a couple of teams in during this time, then you could not be a conference in a couple of years. So that's the biggest thing for me is don't let Duke and UNC go. Don't let North Carolina State go. Don't let a lot of these teams that are on the periphery, are not necessarily the Florida State and Clemson's of the world, but they are huge teams to this conference. Frankly, UNC and Duke are likely bigger than Florida State and Clemson when it comes to the ACC. So it'll be really interesting to see how all of this kind of unfolds. But on the other side of things, Florida State and Clemson have a couple of pros and they have a couple of cons. The biggest pro is obviously going to be you got some more time to figure out what you need to do to get into the SEC or the Big Ten. If there's anything that can be done, I know Florida State is relatively close to possibly getting that AAU accreditation, and frankly, I think the Big Ten would come calling at that point. But it'll be really interesting to watch all of that, and definitely it just gives them a little bit more time to try to get into another conference other than the Big 12. Frankly, I don't necessarily think it's going to work, but at the end of the day, it definitely gives them a little bit more time to try to get that invite to where they really want to go, which is the SEC or the Big Ten. And then, obviously, the big pro is a big con for the ACC, which is the money is going to start falling. You know, the media contract is going to go a little bit further down. You won't have to worry about that quite as much, and maybe you'll be able to handle a little bit more of the financial strain of moving on from the ACC this time next year than you are right now. So that's obviously something that they're watching very closely, and definitely something that they very much want to happen. They need that money to drop pretty drastically if they want to get out of this conference, and obviously they are going to try their best to get it dropped through court and through some of these cases, but at the end of the day, letting some time run off and letting this thing kind of go down just a little bit could help them a lot. And then the biggest con here for me for these two teams is I don't know what happens in these conversations with the ACC and Jim Phillips for these two entities going forward. I don't know how you can go into these meeting rooms and have conversations with everyone else in the ACC when they know you have one foot out the door. And I think it could create kind of interesting conversations where a year ago we were talking about how Florida State didn't get into the playoff, and Florida State was not so happy about the ACC not necessarily being willing to go to bat for them, not being willing to be as outspoken as they would have liked for them to be in the playoff. And I can't imagine they're going to be that way this upcoming year if those two guys are leaving the conference. So that kind of adds an interesting dynamic that kind of is a little bit of the pettiness of college sports to a certain extent, definitely a part of this sport, and a very interesting thing that could affect Florida State or Clemson's season at the end of the day. If there is a college football playoff debate for them, their conference might not be the ones that are really going to bat for them. But that's definitely something that is a little bit hypothetical at this moment, and both these teams should be in the playoff at the end of the day, but it'll be really, really interesting to watch that. And then finally, the number one biggest thing that we have to watch out for in this next little bit as they're staying in the conference is there's a look-in clause for the ESPN contract in February of 2025. If ESPN walks into that room and knows that Florida State and Clemson have one foot out the door, and let's say in the next 4, 5, 6 months, UNC and Duke start looking a little bit more that direction. Maybe NC State does as well. Maybe Miami starts looking to exit the conference. If ESPN knows all of that walking into that room, there's no world where the ACC comes out of that happy. There's no world where they come out of those negotiations feeling really good about where they're at as a conference, because if you know that you're losing two huge assets as ESPN, you're not going to give them as much money. You're going to renegotiate that contract to make it more towards your interests, which are making sure that you're making as much money as possible. And if you lose these two entities, ACC is losing a lot of money. And then if UNC and Duke get in on the conversation, then you're pretty much cooked. I'm just being totally honest. ESPN is not going to come into that room if UNC and Duke are not on the table. If they cannot get that basketball game on their network every single year, they're not going to be interested in the ACC. And that's just kind of the reality, because there's been so many things about the ACC, particularly in college football over the last little bit, but if you're losing the teams that have dominated in college football, particularly Clemson, the team that dominated in college football for so long in that conference, and then you're losing the two biggest basketball products, maybe not only in the ACC, but in the entire country in Duke and UNC, there's no way ESPN is coming to that table with anything that you like to hear. So that's kind of the biggest thing here, and it could be the biggest domino that messes up the ACC, that keeps it intact, that, it'll go any number of ways, but that's going to happen in February. All of that stuff is going to really start to go down in February of 2025. And frankly, if I was the ESPN executive and I knew that Florida State and Clemson were out the door, and I knew that other schools like UNC were looking in that direction, I would have very little interest in the ACC at this very moment, because the only thing that can happen if all of those teams are looking in that direction is the product can really only get worse. Now you can add some teams that make it a little bit, kind of temp that down just a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact that this is not going to be a conference that a lot of these big-time media companies are going to be interested in, because you don't have Florida State, you don't have Clemson for football, you don't have UNC, you don't have Duke for basketball. So it's going to be a very interesting couple of months. And I think the ACC now, you have a little bit of breathing room, but at the end of the day, you still got to get going. You still have to start adding teams, and you still have to make sure that you're in a place where come February, when you walk into that room with ESPN, you can sell X, Y, and Z. You can sell all of these things, and you don't just sell them for 2025. You can sell them for 2030 and for 2035, because that's the worry about this conference is, we know they're going to be around in 2025. Are they going to be around in 2028 and 2030 and all of these years that ESPN's got to worry about? So that'll be really, really fascinating to watch. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about first-year quarterbacks in their new place and first-year head coaches. So combinations of first-year quarterbacks and head coaches coming together for the first time, and how there has been some really great success stories and there's been some not-so-great success stories. And we'll talk about how some of the big-time names in this year for that category, we'll break those down and see who has the best shot to make it happen, who has the best shot to kind of fall on their face a little bit. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about a little bit of an update from the ACC. Florida State and Clemson are staying put through the 2025-26 season, but there's definitely a lot of more questions around the ACC that will definitely start to unroll in the next 6 months, let's say, definitely in February 2025. But let's get into this question around new quarterback head coach combinations. And this is obviously something that is all across the country this upcoming year and has kind of developed a little bit more with transfer quarterbacks and everything in between. But it's definitely a really interesting topic, because tends to be a little bit of a ceiling here. For the most part, it usually takes, a year to really get going in an offense and really find your feet as a quarterback. So say Joe Burrow, he was in his second year at LSU. Michael Penix a year ago, second year at Washington. So there's that ability to kind of get your head around the playbook a little bit better and then hit the ground running your second year. But there are some people this upcoming year that won't have that shot. So we'll have to figure out, who can really catch lightning in a bottle. And there are some plenty of good examples out there. Obviously, Jalen Hurts came in as a freshman and led them to a playoff appearance. So that was obviously a huge success story. You also have Baker going in Lincoln Riley. His first season there, they went to a playoff and did some really remarkable things. And then the guy that really takes the cake here is obviously freshman Trevor Lawrence. He won the national title in 2018 in his very first year, and it was remarkable to watch. It's one of the crazier seasons that I've ever seen, and definitely a really, really remarkable thing, but it's not a normal thing by any means. Usually the teams that win that national title are ones that have had their quarterback in that system for a number of years and have had him develop into the quarterback that they want him to be. So who kind of faces that this upcoming year? There are a ton of teams that go into that, and I think the 4 that I want to highlight here are Ohio State, Alabama, Oregon, and Florida State, but there are a ton more that could definitely be broken down in time. But let's start in Ohio State, and Ryan Day and Will Howard is a very, very interesting duo, and frankly, it'll be more Will Howard and Chip Kelly more than anything else, but Ryan Day will still have plenty of say in this offense and how it goes about business. But the big question I have here is just, how quickly can Will Howard get a handle on this playbook? Because, as we all know, Chip Kelly's offense is incredible. It's awesome to watch, and there's so many great things that can happen from it. It doesn't mean it's easy to learn. It doesn't mean it's easy on the quarterback. It's definitely really, really tough to learn, but once you get it going and once you have a full grasp on it, amazing things can happen, like what we saw with Marcus Mariota in his Heisman season, which is one of the best quarterback seasons we've ever seen. So it's one of those things where it is a nice playbook. It is something that is a little bit QB friendly, but you got to make sure that you're ready to take in all of that information, and you got to make sure your QB is in a position to handle all of that information, and then it could be just absolutely incredible. So it'll be really interesting to watch this. Obviously, one of the big time things here is he doesn't have to be spectacular. There are so many great players on this team. The elite running back duo they have, the what feels like a million amazing wide receivers they have, in my opinion, the best defense in the entire country. B football will likely get them to the playoff, but frankly, that's not enough for Ohio State this upcoming year. I think every single Ohio State fan would tell you that. They want to win a national title, and at some point, he's going to have to play A-plus football that let that happen. You know, you can't go up against Georgia. You can't go up against Oregon. You can't go up against Texas in those playoff games without playing A-plus football if you want to move on. That's just the reality. Every single year, you always have a quarterback that makes those couple of plays. For last year, you know, J.J. McCarthy wasn't necessarily spectacular, didn't light the scoreboard on fire, but he made that one big-time play against Alabama, which was one of the craziest, most athletic plays I've seen from a quarterback. And then you also had, you know, a couple of plays in the Ohio State game, and he made the plays down the stretch that you need to make. Can Will Howard do that is probably the biggest question that I have for that. I tend to think yes, but it'll really come down to how comfortable he is in this offense at the end of the year. But moving on to Alabama, Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer is one of the interesting fits in the entire country, because the first time that you heard that Kalen DeBoer was hired, I think all of us thought, is Jalen Milroe going to be the starter for this offense? Because he doesn't really fit. If you look from a skill perspective between him and Michael Penix, they're two very, very different things. And it was one of those things that you were curious, you know, is Jalen Milroe even going to be the starter at the beginning of the year? He's obviously going to be the starter. There's no two ways about that. And I don't think he's a perfect quarterback for Kalen DeBoer, but I do think Kalen DeBoer is good enough and incredible enough on the offensive side of the ball to fit his quarterback strength and lean into that run game a little bit more this upcoming year. So it's kind of, as J.D. Pickell said it so eloquently, it's kind of like fries in a milkshake. It shouldn't work, but it seems like it's going to, and it'll definitely be really, really interesting to watch that. I think this comes back to the exact same thing to me, as we talked about with Will Howard, where at some point he has to make those throws that he couldn't make a year ago. He's going to have to make those layered throws that are not easy to make, and that guys like Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers and some of the other elite quarterbacks out there make on a pretty regular basis. So that needs to be something that he's going to have to take a huge step forward in, but the reality is this offense is going to be fit around him. He's not going to have to fit around this offense. So it'll be really interesting to see how this offense is run, and is it as aggressive as we expect it to be? Is it, you know, really run heavy? Is it, you know, taking deep shots? Or has Jalen Milroe taken the steps forward that he needs to take in the throws that win you championships? Those 15 to 20 yard throws that are over a cornerback and under a safety, or over a linebacker and under a safety. Those are the throws that he's going to have to make at some point this season, and if he can't make them, then they're going to be in trouble. And then you get to the group that I frankly think has the best fit of the bunch, and that's Dillon Gabriel and Dan Lanning. I think this is obviously more Will Stein and Dillon Gabriel, but definitely a really, really interesting thing. And I think Will Stein and Dillon Gabriel just fit together like two puzzle pieces, honestly. I think they're absolutely perfect fits for what each of them want to do, and I think Dillon Gabriel's the guy on this list that I can say unequivocally, without question, is going to play really good football this upcoming year. I think all of them are going to play good football, but there's no doubt in my mind that Dillon Gabriel is going to be off running from week 1 and is going to play good football all the way through week 14. So that's kind of the difference between him and some of the other guys on this list. Is some of the other guys are just a little bit more variable, and it'll be really interesting to watch all of that kind of unfold. And you got to realize one of the big things here, and one of the big worries I have here, is there's those big games. Can you make the plays in those big time games? Obviously, he did that at Oklahoma against Texas, and then kind of struggled in later in the season after some injuries and some things popped up in those big time games. So you're going to have to be really special against the Ohio States and the UGAs of the world to win that. So I think they're going to be fine when it comes to quarterback play, but when it comes to those big time plays, when it comes to facing those defenses that are going to be really tough to face, how does he handle that will be a very interesting thing to watch. But out of this group, I feel very confident that this is probably the best fit of the bunch, and probably the one that gives me the most confidence going into this season of at least they're going to play really good football at the quarterback position. And then finally, Florida State and Mike Norvell and DJ Uiagalelei is the biggest question mark in my eyes, just because I don't really understand. I don't want to say it that way. DJ is a very good player. I think he plays good football. He plays consistent football, and he's someone that absolutely can be a really good football player. The ceiling is still there. That was there when he came to Clemson the first time around. But at the end of the day, I don't know if he's a championship quarterback. I don't know if he's the guy that can get Florida State where they need to go, even with the incredible defense that they have. Kind of in the same boat that Will Howard is, where he doesn't have to play elite football every single week for them to win. They're going to play really good defense, and they're going to be really hard to beat on that side of the ball. So you don't necessarily have to be perfect. You just have to execute. But the issue is his accuracy has not necessarily been his calling card, and it kind of has to be in this offense if they really want it to run the way they really expect it to. And you're losing so many guys on offense. There's so many questions. I think that Mike Norvell and Alex Atkins have just their work cut out for them to figure out how this offense is going to work and how it's going to work to the level of a Miami or a Clemson or some of the other teams in this conference. And then once you get to the playoff, you got to compete with Oregon. You got to compete with Ohio State, Texas, Georgia, all of the teams that are pretty much well-oiled machines on that side of the ball. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch. But at the end of the day, this is a duo that I think is capable of doing some really good things, but I definitely have some more questions about this group than all the other ones on the list. But then that doesn't even include Notre Dame, who's introducing Riley Leonard. You have Michigan with Alex Orji and technically Sharon Moore, but obviously it's a little bit different with some of the different changes over there. Miami, another one that definitely will have a ton. So will this precedent hold up? Will there be a Trevor Lawrence type guy in this group? Is there a team that can kind of break through that glass ceiling? Obviously, Trevor Lawrence would be a little bit more apt to what Dylan Raiola could do this upcoming season, which would be out of this world crazy. But at the end of the day, if you fully subscribe to this can't happen in their very first year, transfer quarterbacks need a little bit of time to get going before they can really hit the heights that they want, like a Joe Burrow or a Michael Penix, then go with UGA, Texas, Ole Miss, Missouri, some of the teams that have that safe quarterback and have that safe head coach and OC that you feel really comfortable about. So it'll be really interesting to see how all of this kind of unfolds, but I've always been a part of the group that has said, as the transfer portal heats up even more, continuity is going to be the thing that wins out. So I tend to believe that this is likely the way that things are going to go this upcoming season, but there are some really talented new quarterbacks and new systems, and it would not surprise me at all if one of them were to win the national title. But if you think, you got to have a little time to get things going, then UGA and Texas might be the two teams for you. But we'll break that down as it kind of goes on throughout the season. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to go back to doing hinge players across each conference. We've done the SEC, we've done the Big Ten. Now we'll do the Big 12, and we'll break down some of the biggest players as I see it in that conference. So stick with us, and we'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the players that are going into new systems, whether that's a transfer quarterback or a new head coach or what have you. Definitely a lot of really interesting kind of dynamics throughout the season and who can break through and possibly be that Trevor Lawrence who comes in and immediately wins a national title. It'll be really interesting to watch all of that. But let's get into some hinge players in the Big 12. There's a ton to break down here. We've done the SEC, we've done the Big 10. Now we're going to get into the Big 12, and there's a ton of guys to choose from for just about every single one of these teams, but I feel like I've narrowed it down pretty well here, and the guy I want to start with is Jordan Seaton. I think he might be the most important player for Colorado that is not named Shedeur Sanders. He is someone that absolutely has the most important job on the field, which is keeping that guy upright, and he absolutely needs to be incredible pretty much from the get-go for them to be really potent on the offensive side of the ball. Obviously, starting at left tackle as a freshman is really tough. There's no two ways about that. Will Campbell and Kelvin Banks did it at LSU and Texas, respectively, and they did fine. They played some really good football throughout their freshman years, but there were moments where they had to face some more veteran guys, and it didn't look all that great. They definitely got beat a couple of times, and Jordan Seaton can let that happen. It's not necessarily he has to be totally lights out throughout the entire season, but he definitely does need a big time. He needs a big time season. There's no two ways about that. He needs to keep Shedeur Sanders upright, and if he can do that, this offense gets really dangerous. And frankly, I think this might be the biggest high school commit that Deion's gotten at Colorado. It's as big as anyone that I've seen, and then I think it's maybe the second biggest commit he's ever gotten behind Travis Hunter, because that was the one that really got everything rolling for him. But this is one that absolutely could have everything to do with the next chapter of his coaching career and becoming not only a coach at a big-time university and kind of building up all of this hype, but being someone that delivers on a yearly basis and is one of the top coaches in the country. So this is the guy that frankly can unlock this offense. There's so many things in place for Colorado, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and if you have a left tackle that is really, really tough to beat, then Shedeur Sanders is going to be able to pick apart some really, really good defenses this upcoming year. But let's move on to Oklahoma State, and Alan Bowman, I think, is huge for this team. We talked about this yesterday a little bit with some of the turnover issues he's had in the past and how I think it might be a little bit of more of a trouble for him this upcoming season, but if he can fix that, then this is a very dangerous team, and this is a very dangerous player in particular, and they can absolutely win this conference. So I think they have a remarkably high floor with someone like Ollie Gordon and with some of the receivers and the offensive line that they have and the experience they have on defense. They're probably going to win at least 8-9 games. I feel pretty confident in that, but the ceiling is not too far from the floor. In terms of just what they can be, it all comes down to how good this guy can be. How good can Alan Bowman be, and can he open up this offense a little bit? Because if he can, spread the defenses out a little bit and make it tougher for them to key in on Ollie Gordon, this is going to be a really, really tough team to beat. Maybe even impossible to beat for some of these Big 12 teams, because if you can't key on Ollie Gordon, then he's going to tear you to pieces. So I think this is a guy that absolutely can be a really good player, but you look across with this conference with all the incredible quarterbacks in, I'm just not sure that he matches up with everyone else. But if he does hit that, jackpot, plays A+ football, then this just might be your Big 12 champion. Another guy that holds so much in his hands is Jalen Daniels. He's someone that, frankly, I think can shake up the entirety of college football. I think that's how good this kid is, and the wide receivers he has from a year ago are all back. There's a ton of connection there. I think Kansas is a team that we've seen over the last couple of years. They go as far as that guy goes. If he is healthy, then they're going to play really good football, and they're going to be tough to deal with. If he is not healthy, then you can kind of key on the run and make it a little bit easier for your team to really dominate in some of these cases. So definitely will not be ideal. If he's on the field, they're a Big 12 contender. If he's off the field, they win 7 or 8 games. I feel pretty good about that. I think Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw give him a little bit of ability to spread out the ball a little bit more. They're going to want to key on the run for Kansas because that's where the big-time stars are. But this guy can spread the ball out. There's no two ways about that. And as long as he can, get into the QB run game a little bit, spread the ball out to a lot of these really talented receivers, I think this is going to be a really potent offense. But this guy is at the very center of it. And then someone who took the world by storm last year when he was playing just ridiculous football is Noah Fafita, and he absolutely is someone that, frankly, has the highest ceiling of all of these guys that I'm mentioning here, but I think he's someone that can totally open things up this upcoming season. He has one of the best wide receivers in the country with Tatori McMillan, and they have one of the best connections in the country. So definitely we'll have a very, very good duo there, but they're definitely going to be under a lot of tough situations. I think one of the big things in this conference that you'll find, and they kind of do this a little bit in the Pac-12, although to a different degree, they drop a lot of people in coverage, and they make it really tough, and you have to throw it into really, really tight windows. Noah Fafita's got to be able to do that if he wants to, win the Big 12 and do some of the things that Arizona absolutely has on the table. So I think he's someone that, we'll figure out, is it Jedd Fisch that made him so special, or is Noah Fafita just that guy? And I definitely lean a little bit more towards the latter, but at the end of the day, he could absolutely be the best quarterback in this conference this upcoming year and just ruin the fun for a lot of the contenders out there. So it'll be really interesting. We'll figure out pretty early on, because I think in week 4 and 5, if I'm not mistaken, they go to Kansas State and then play Utah. So they're up against it pretty early on, and if they can handle those 2 games, then they're off running, that's for sure. And then Iowa State, Jaden Higgins is someone that, frankly, I could have picked a number of people for Iowa State. There's no two ways about that. They have a ton of guys that need to come up huge, and Rocco Becht, their quarterback, being among them. But I think this guy's just an absolute difference maker. I think he's someone that is going to be pretty much impossible to guard for most of the corners in this conference, and it makes Iowa State one of those teams that you just got to watch a little bit closer. Him and Jalen Noel are two of maybe the best duo of wide receivers in this entire conference, and no one's talking about him. And I think it's really, really interesting. I saw Josh Pate has Iowa State going to the conference title, although you'd be hard-pressed to make him not make that pick, but that's beside the point. I do think there's going to be really, really interesting to watch this guy play. I think he's an all Big 12 type guy, but he's fighting with guys like Tatori McMillan, like Jalen Noel, like Dorian Singer, like Travis Hunter, LaJohntay Wester. There's so many great receivers in this conference, but I would put this guy number 2 right behind Tatori McMillan, because he is out of this world good, and he's someone that, if Iowa State is going to make a run to a Big 12 title, he's going to do some special things and become a household name pretty much all across America this upcoming year. So that'll be awesome to watch. And then finally, I got Garrett Green, someone who honestly is a little bit overlooked, although there are a lot of people singing his praises from time to time. I think he's someone that just kind of goes under the radar a little bit, especially with all of the different stuff going on in this conference with Colorado and a ton of teams coming in and all of the different things. There's not too much time to talk about West Virginia, but Garrett Green is a very, very fun player. He's someone that walks onto the field every time like it is the last time he's going to walk onto a football field, and he plays that way. He plays really hard-nosed, kind of reminds me of a Baker Mayfield type guy, where he just plays with a little bit of anger that a lot of people don't, and it's really, really entertaining to watch. So absolutely love this kid. I think the run game is absolutely huge for him. He's got to be able to open up some of that passing lanes that he's really good at hitting if they're, open for him, if they're not dropping 8 in coverage every single time. And Jaheim White is a fantastic running back, so definitely will be able to open that up for him a little bit, and he also can run a little bit, so definitely not super worried about that part of the game. But it's going to be huge for him to take a step forward, because this is a team that really got a lot of people's attention last year, where there were a lot of people going into the season, myself included, that thought Neil Brown wouldn't make it through the season. He did, and they had a really, really good season on top of that. So it'll be really awesome to watch this team unfold, and they're one of those teams that you just got to keep your eyes open for. You just got to be watching out of the side of your eye and make sure that they're still where they are, because they're a very dangerous team. And frankly, I think they might just be able to get to Arlington based off this guy's stubbornness to lose. He absolutely is one of those guys that is going to do literally everything in his physical power to make sure that they win as many football games as possible. So he's someone that I absolutely love. I think his energy is just infectious, and I think he's someone that really fits what West Virginia is going to do. So I think when you look across this conference, there's so many incredible quarterbacks that are really, really cool to watch, like Shedeur Sanders, like Noah Fafita, like Avery Johnson. But this is a guy that just continues to get the job done and continues to get better every single year. And if he takes that another step forward, then West Virginia is not only a team that you have to worry about on one Saturday, they're a team you have to worry about the entire year, because you might just end up seeing them in Arlington. So there are a ton of players in the Big 12 that are going to be huge hinge players for this conference, but when I look up at the top, there's not as much worry, if I'm being totally honest. Kansas State and Utah, I think, are going to be really good products, and I think Avery Johnson and Cam Rising are going to play really good football. I think some of the other guys on that list are kind of finding themselves in a little bit of a gray area, and can they play elite football? Can they play good football? Are they going to play mediocre football? Will definitely be a huge topic of conversation, but at the end of the day, it'll be fascinating to watch this conference because there's so many players, there's so many teams that can totally shake this thing up on one Saturday. So absolutely love this conference, and we'll continue talking about it right now. We're going to get into hot takes for all the contenders. We did, I believe, 5 of them yesterday. We're going to do 6 more today because there are at least 11 teams that absolutely can make a run at this title this upcoming year. So we'll continue on with the Big 12 here, and then we'll get into some other hot takes for some contenders and other conferences as the week goes on. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the hinge players in the Big 12, a ton of players that we could have unpacked there, but narrowed it down to a couple that I think are hugely important for this conference this upcoming year. But let's stay with the Big 12, and let's break down some hot takes for some of the conference contenders. There's a ton of stuff to break down in this conference, but we broke down, I believe, 5 of them yesterday, and definitely some of the big-time ones. But let's get to the rest of this conference, because there's at least 10 or 11 teams that can win this thing this upcoming year. And let's start with UCF. And my take here is the amount of transfers that they brought in will actually keep them from competing in this conference this upcoming year. And it's a problem that I've seen kind of just around the Big 12 in general, and I really like this team. I think they took a big-time step forward when it comes to talent acquisition and being at a place where you can compete talent-wise with some of the other teams. But at the end of the day, they don't have something that a ton of other Big 12 teams have, which is experience in the system, which is comfort in that system and veteran leadership. And it's something that is going to be hugely important. And Gus Malzahn can absolutely make something happen out of thin air. He's very, very talented and someone that has a ton at his disposal now, which is going to be hugely important. I think the run game is going to be really, really fun with KJ Jefferson, and then RJ Harvey is awesome. Penny Boone is going to be incredible. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch. I don't love this O-line. I think the wide receivers are better, but not necessarily up to the level of the rest in the conference. I think there's this thing going around where a ton of people are going into the transfer portal, and that's all well and good, and some have to do it, and I think UCF was among that team. This is kind of a necessary thing for them to get where they want to go in the next couple of years, but I do think that this year it might just hold them back from being that elite team that they can be, because while Cam Rising knows the playbook like the back of his hand, KJ Jefferson might just be trying to figure out a lot of things going into the first week or maybe going throughout the season. So I think that's the biggest thing I take away from UCF is plenty more talented, plenty more dangerous, definitely a team that is going in the right direction, but a team that is walking a little bit of a tightrope, and frankly, I think it's going to be a little bit too tight, if I'm being honest. But then let's move on to Iowa State, and I have a take about this one. I think this team will have only one loss going into the final 2 weeks of the season, and I think that is going to be just incredible to watch because frankly, it's not necessarily an easy schedule by any means before the last 2 weeks of the season, but they're a good enough team to knock off all of the teams ahead of them. And as we just talked about, they have dangerous guys all over the place, whether it's Rocco Becht or Abu Sama, who's running the ball, or Jalen Noel, Jaden Higgins. There's so many really, really good players on this Iowa State team, and it's finally a team that kind of resembles that 2020 team that Matt Campbell did incredible things with. So it'll be really interesting to watch. Now, the issue is the final 2 games of the season are Utah and then Kansas State. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee you anything if you do get to that point with only 1 loss, but it at least gives them a shot. There's no two ways about that. And there's 4 games really before that really are going to decide this one way or the other. And it's Iowa, at West Virginia, at Kansas, and Texas Tech. If they can go 3-1 in those games, they're going to be in really good shape. Now, that Iowa game is not going to be easy. It never is. At Kansas is a big-time battle, and then Texas Tech and West Virginia are just going to be 2 very dangerous teams that everyone's going to have to worry about at the end of the day. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch this team, but you absolutely have the ability to do this, and if they can, then maybe they only have to split those games in the last 2 weeks of the season to make it to Arlington and be fighting for a playoff spot, which would be very, very interesting to watch. But I really like this team, and I think they're just going to be really hard to forced to make mistakes. I think they're just going to go about their business, make all the plays that they need to make, and at the end of the day, find themselves on the winning side of things more often than not. So definitely a really interesting team and a team that I absolutely love going into this season. But let's move on to Arizona, and let's talk about Noah Fifita that we just talked about not too long ago. Frankly, I think he's going to take a step back in 2024. I think this is a very, very good player, and I think his ceiling is just absolutely through the roof. I just think there's too many things changing for him to be able to keep up that level that he was playing at last year. I think the talent is good. The wide receivers are plenty good, especially with Torrey McMillan. But the running game, I think, is going to take a big-time step back. Losing someone like Jonah Coleman is absolutely a huge loss. Losing a first-rounder offensive tackle in Jordan Morgan is absolutely going to hurt. And then I think Jedd Fisch leaving is going to hurt this guy. Although I think he was a huge reason that Jedd Fisch was as successful, I think it's a two-way street. So definitely something that I don't think necessarily helps him going into the season. Now, the good news for Arizona fans is there's not necessarily this need for him to make all of these incredible, awesome plays. And frankly, his B-plus football is a lot better than a lot of quarterbacks' A-plus football. So he could take a step back and still be a really good player this upcoming year. But at the end of the day, when I look at this offense and I look at this team overall, I just don't see them as the same team they were a year ago. I see them as a little bit more variable, a little bit more dangerous, and one of those teams that absolutely can be really good, but could take a big-time step back. And we talked about it earlier, but one of the big things in the Big 12 is that drop 8 defense. You know, they're only going to rush 3 guys. They're going to make you throw into those really tight windows, and it's going to force a couple more turnovers. So it'll be really interesting to see how he kind of goes through this season, but after what was just a magical 2023, I think a step back is more than likely for Noah Fifita this upcoming season. But let's move on to Texas Tech, and let's talk about Micah Hudson. He is a very talented freshman that is coming in for the Red Raiders, and I think he's going to lead them in receiving yards. I really like Josh Kelly. I really like Caleb Douglas, and I think they're going to help this offense a ton, but I think Hudson is the difference maker. I think he's the guy that, they brought him in to be one of the best wide receivers they've had there in a very long time. There was no doubt about it. They brought this guy in to be an absolute game changer from day one, and I think he's going to be that. He's a very, very good enemy route runner wherever you put him on the field, and I think that's what Baron Morton needs. He's not necessarily going to be a guy that, fits balls into really, really tight windows or does anything incredible in the pocket, but he's absolutely someone that can put the ball where it needs to be as long as you get some separation, and this guy can get plenty of separation, that's for sure. So I think this is someone that kind of opens up Texas Tech's offense and absolutely is someone that, you brought in to be an elite player. You brought in to be maybe the best receiver you've had since Michael Crabtree. So let's get off running, and I definitely think he's someone that can do that and just be an absolute menace among a lot of these defenses in this conference. So absolutely love this kid, and I think he's going to make quite the mark for the Red Raiders this upcoming season. West Virginia is really, really fascinating to me, but at the end of the day, I think they're going to be fighting to make a bowl game at the end of the year, and it's not necessarily about how good this team is. I frankly think they're a really good team. I just think their schedule to start the year is an absolute gauntlet. They start with Penn State, obviously, which is a very, very tough game. Likely a loss at this point, the way I look at it, but we'll see what happens as it kind of comes a little bit closer. And then you got Kansas, you got Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Kansas State, and then Arizona to open the conference schedule, all of those in succession. That's an absolute nightmare. I don't know how they come out on top in the majority of those games, if I'm being totally honest. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch this team. I think they're a very dangerous team. I think they're a team that is going to be not easy to deal with for a lot of these other teams in the conference. But when you face all of the elite teams in the conference pretty much in a row, you're going to have a really tough time. And it's definitely going to cause some problems. They do dodge Utah, which is a big-time win, but it doesn't necessarily help things. Now, on the back end, you do have some doable games. You have Cincinnati, Baylor, UCF, Texas Tech. All of those games are games that they can absolutely win. But at the end of the day, they might have to win all 4 of those games to get to 6 wins, because there's a reality where they lose to Penn State, they lose to Kansas, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Kansas State, and Arizona. That puts you at 6 losses already before you even go into really the tail end of their schedule. So there's going to be so much going into the season, and they're going to have to steal some of those games early on in the season if they really want to compete in this conference. But as I look at it right now, that 6-win marker might just be the spot that they want to land at this upcoming year, because the schedule is just an absolute nightmare, especially to start. But let's move on to TCU and finish it out here with Cam Cook. And I think he's someone that is going to make an All-American, not an All-American team, an All-Big 12 team. I think that's how good this kid is, and it's going to be incredibly tough for him to do that. There are some dudes at running back in the Big 12, whether it's Ollie Gordon, Taj Brooks, RJ Harvey, Devin Neal, Penny Boone, whoever you want to pick. There's a million guys that he's going to have to pass up to do this, but frankly, I think he has a big-time opening, and I think this offense is just going to lean on him really aggressively. They brought in some big-time transfers at offensive line after it was not a good year on offensive line a year ago, and they brought in 4 new guys. They'll obviously have to get them to gel, but I think they got a ton better on that in that specific position room. And I think when you talk about this offense this upcoming year, Josh Hoover is a fine player. He's a good passer and definitely someone that can move the ball down the field, but they're going to have to run the ball, and they're going to have to be very aggressive in that, and I think that's what Sonny Dykes wants to do. When you look back at that 2022 season, obviously Max Duggan made plenty of plays through the air, but there were some guys in the backfield that absolutely made that a lot easier for him to do. So Sonny Dykes, if he's going to open up this offense, it's going to start with the run game, and it's going to start with Cam Cook. So I frankly think he's a guy that, he got injured last year, wasn't able to really show who he is. I think this is the year where he really comes onto the scene and just absolutely explodes. I don't know who he beats out for those spots in the All-Big 12 team. I don't know if it's RJ Harvey or it's Devin Neal. I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think Cam Cook is one of those guys that is super, super dangerous. And you might not know the name now, but you absolutely will by the end of the season. But at the end of the day, the Big 12 is one of the most craziest conferences in this upcoming year. One of those that you just cannot get a beat on for the life of you. So it's going to be really hard to pick to figure out, who do I want in my championship, which if anyone does not know, next week will be all about predictions. We will break down every single conference. We'll get into the playoff picture, the Heisman. I'll break down everything that we need to break down in next week's shows. But at the end of the day, this is a conference that I might just have to really sit down and use my full brain power for, because it's going to be incredibly tough to pick and going to be one of those that is going to come down to the wire. And there's about 10 teams that absolutely could be in that conversation. So it's going to be awesome to watch, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We just have really incredible people doing awesome work across every single sport you could want. So anything you need in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.